All right, we're back with Live with Hal Gill, your host, and the Museum of Early American Tools by Eric Sloan. I was reading earlier that the back of it has a quote from Stuart Brand at the last Whole Earth catalog where he says, "Behind making your own stuff, there's another level, making your own tools to make your own stuff." And this book gives detailed design information and fine illustration of America's pre industrial tools. Okay. And it also says, you can find out not only what these tools were, but how to use them, and whistle while you work and revel in nostalgia. Tell the 20th century to go jump. Stuart Brand. So, we're going to do a little reading of this. This is along the lines of what my inspiration for doing these live things from the bunker is. Patty Smith. She does little readings from Uncle Wiggily. I'm going to read you from a Museum of Early American Tools by Eric Sloan, Ballantine Books, New York. This is the first printing of the Ballantine edition, published by arrangement with Funk and Wagnalls Incorporated. It was originally published in 1974. This is the first printing of the Ballantine book edition, October 1973. This sketchbook is dedicated to the unrecorded pioneer Americans who fashioned their own tools, although mass production has made their old tools obsolete. Along with early American individualism, these ancient implements are symbols of sincerity and integrity and an excellency that the unionized craftsmen of today might do well to emulate. And it opens up with a special tool for every job, and it has many different illustrations of tools, and you can see them there. I'm not going to read each one of them, but the rasping hooks, hitting beetle, apple butter paddle, you name it. And it says in the opening from an old pamphlet of 1719, "The carpenter who builds a good house to defend us from wind and weather is far more serviceable than the curious carver who employs his art to please his Janie, or his fancy, please his fancy." The script can be a little difficult to read at first, but author's note is pretty easy. I like the sound of the word museum, perhaps because the root of the word refers less to an actual collection of things than to the musing, cogitating, and reflecting that one does while beholding a collection. Nowadays, we use the word museum to identify a big, housed collection, but in the days of early America, it usually meant a simple library or some printed collection of facts. There were magazine-like books such as Merry Museum, and there were newspaper-like publications such as The Farmer's Museum. But the fine word museum has since drifted from the world of writing. Because it is my hobby to recapture what I believe to be the good things of the past, I hope the reader will accept and enjoy my title, A Museum of Early American Tools. The word magazine was first used to identify what we now might call a museum. It then meant storehouse or housed collection, powder magazine, for example. And the first printed magazines were, like the newspapers of that day, printed on one piece of paper and folded once or perhaps twice, never in the book form of today's magazine. In presenting my collection of drawings as a museum, I hope that it will, like a scrapbook, induce musing and reflecting, and that it will draw the reader back into the quite different world of early America. The rambling sequence of subjects is no accident. I would like my reader to stroll through the book as he would through a museum. We might regard some of the old tools as clumsy or ugly unless we look at them in terms of the century in which they were used. Many of today's tools would have been considered ugly, clumsy, and completely undesirable by the early craftsmen. The steel and plastic handles we now have, for example, lack the spring and feel of seasoned wood that experts knew. Shovels were made of wood not because of a lack of metal, as many assume, but because it was supposed that the grain and apples were harmed by contact with metal. You might think of a wooden shovel as being short-lived, yet Although thousands of wooden shovels are to be found in antique shops and collections, almost no early metal shovels remain. Most of today's tools have the cheapness of mass production. The old handmade tools often had design that made them examples of fine art. Lumber cut and sold as a 2x4 was once an honest 2 inches by 4 inches. Even today, there are people who are shocked to learn that our lumber, because it is measured before being trimmed and planed, is sold at a quite untrue measurement. Builders who constructed rooms that were not accurately square, why should they be, are now regarded as slipshod and careless. Yet the old buildings have stood the test much better than will many we are now building, for the joints and braces were made with much greater care than today's craftsmen considered, quote, necessary, unquote. Floorboards were never the same width at one end as they were at the other. Quaint or poor workmanship? Not at all. The finished effect is finer than the monotony of today's narrow width floorboards. A building pinned together with hand whittled wooden pins? We don't have to do that sort of thing today. But if we built for lastingness and for handing down to future generations, we would do so. For wooden pins work much better than nails. They hold tighter, they don't rust, and rot the beams. While I was putting this book together, my neighbor bought a good new saw and left it out overnight in the dew. Its shiny newness had given way to the orange of rust. He telephoned me for help in removing it. I took it to clean and loaned him one of my early saws to use in the meantime. The old saw was one I found in the stone wall of an ancient barn. It is still sharp and clean of rust, and so it goes. The craftsman of yesterday might look like a poorly informed man only before we takes a longer and better look. His tools might appear pathetically poor, but his ways were honest and lasting and beautiful to an extent that is today deemed over and above requirements. How poor and honest and ugly and temporary are the results of so many workers whose constant aim is more to make the most money from their profession instead of producing the most honest and beautiful and lasting things. I feel that a good way of studying the conscience and personality of the anonymous pioneer American, so that I may emulate some of his ways, is by collecting and analyzing the tools with which he worked. As a collector of early tools, I have also been a collector of information. Antique implements have a price tag on them, but for information that has been priceless and gratis, I am indebted to the men at Doylestown, Shelburne, Winterthur, Cooperstown, Sturbridge, Williamsburg, and Saugus. I learned much from two excellent books, Mercer's Ancient Carpenter's Tools and Wildung's Woodworking Tools, and from the Early American Industries Association publication, The Chronicle. And that's from Eric Sloan at Weather Hill. And the lines of early tools were traditional, functional, honest, beautiful, in a harmonious simplicity. And there you have a few of his illustrations of some of the tools. So that is the author's notes to, and the table of contents is here. And we'll be reading sections of this book in lives that I go on with in the future. It starts out with a section called the Romance of Tools. Then it goes to crude shops, magnificent results, an axe is an axe, a world of axes, the broad axe, how the broad axe was used, a giant and a midget, the hatchet, hammers, the axe and the log house, the adze, canoes and bowls, wedges and froes, the fine art of splitting, tools with legs, the American horse for making schnitzels, little shavers and big, the days of river rafting, tools of river lumbermen, of cider and apple butter, the removed bark, two heads are better than one, the chisels and gouges, planes, the molding plane, the rabbit, the plow, early American saws, a gallery of frame saws, the biggest saws, to make a hole bigger, to make a bigger hole, the brace or bit stock, the things you'll find in a barn. Some were special. These were tools too. Jacks, the blacksmith, wrought nail making, tanners and curriers, about wheels. It's all in the way you hit it. Hay implements, knives and grass, found in the barn, and an index. And then we get to the very title page of A Museum of Early American Tools. 1964 publication, folks. Eric Sloan, the author. And I've been reading a little bit, so we'll go into the first chapter, The Romance of Tools. And I see we have a few of you joining us here. Thank you for joining. This is one of the many things I do on Harrowings. In this case, I'm reading you the book called A Museum of Early American Tools by Eric Sloan. So the romance of tools. Finding an ancient tool in a stone fence or in a dark corner of some decaying barn is receiving a symbol from another world, or it gives you a particular and interesting contact with the past. Men used to build and create as much for future generations as for their own needs, so their tools have a special message for us and our time. When you hold an early implement, when you close your hand over the worn wooden handle, you know exactly how it felt to the craftsman whose hand had smoothed it to its rich patina. In that instant, you are as close to that craftsman as you can be, even closer than if you live in the house that he built or sit in the chair that he made. In that moment, you are near to another being in another life, and you are that much richer. Why an ancient tool should be closer to the early craftsman than a modern tool is to a modern workman is not readily understood by most people. Even the ardent collector is sometimes unaware of the reason an ancient tool meant so much to its user. But reason there is. Henry Ward Beecher said it nicely when he explained that a tool is but the extension of a man's hand, whereas today's implements are designed with the idea of getting the job done quickly. There was an added quality to the early implements and an added quality to early workmanship too, for like the nails on a beast's paws, the old nails were so much an extension of a man's hand or an added appendage to his arm that the resulting workmanship seemed to flow directly from the body of the maker and to carry something of himself into the work. True, by looking at an old house or an old piece of furniture, you can imagine the maker much more clearly than you can by beholding anything made today. The early implement was also a piece of art as much as the work it fashioned, for the worker designed his tools too. In early America, the iron workers forged only the cutting blade. They gave no thought to the design of the wooden handle and the rest of the finished tool. Plane blades and even knife blades were hand-forged and sold like axe heads, and the craftsman was left to make his own wooden hand to hold the fingernail or cutting part. A small hand needed a small handle, and a big hand needed a big handle. The man who used an apprentice had notches in his big plane that enabled the apprentice to help push it along with a stick. A man whose architectural creations followed the Greek or Roman tradition would find it natural to include Greek or Roman artistic touches in the ornamentation of his implements. Decoration on the early tool, however, sprang from the pride of the maker rather than from any custom. The feeling that certain tools had souls their own was not unusual. An axe might be marked Tom or Jack simply because the owner felt it was a companion worthy of a pet name. All this sounds strangely superstitious, yet today motor trucks are often named Sally or Babe. Boats almost always have names. Even large machine tools such as presses or bulldozers are graced with pet names. Like extension of the human hand, the illustration above shows a scraper and an adze of sorts. Looks like a cooper's tool to me. I'm not positive. The religious man probably felt that sacred initials or biblical quotations might have their effect upon the work done by that tool. Perhaps mindful that the carpenter Jesus once worked with such tools, some of the early woodworking implements have crosses carved upon them, and a 1766 plane has sacred initials on one side and the date on the other. There you go. And then it has a illustration below that, a Germanic, Northern Germanic tool there. So one of the finer pieces in recent showing of modern art was a piece of steel that curved like a bird's wing. It was set into a square block of wood, and its title in the catalog was number 1760. The artist had an even more honest sense of beauty than a sense of humor, for if you looked closely and with an informed eye, you would recognize the piece as the head of an early American goose wing broadaxe. In the back of the blade, the year 1760 had been marked, which of course explained the title. To many, it was at first the most beautiful piece of art there, but when they learned that it was only an old axe head, they felt as if they had been hoaxed. How, after all, could an axe head be considered a work of art? This Civil War period marked a big turning point in tool design, as it did for so many Americans, because before this time, the word tool meant an implement that could make one thing at a time. Mass production tools then entered the scene, and the word tool, which had meant only hand tool, took on many different added meanings. Finally, the word tool came to mean any item having to do with the production of an item. It could be the machine and also the building that housed the machine, even the salesman, the advertising gadgets, and the business offices are tools of the trade. Generally speaking, hand tools made after the Civil War period lacked the simple beauty of those of the antebellum period. Things were made to sell quickly. Things were made in large quantities so they could be cataloged identically, and handmade implements began to disappear. Wooden handles became fancier, more curved and ornamental, but the severe beauty of folk art and primitive usage was lost. Saw handles became trickier. They were designed to appeal to the eye instead of to fit the hand. Axe handles, which had always been almost straight as a good club should be, took on curves such as the fawn foot and the scroll knob. By 1885, handles on axes and adzes had become almost too curved, but by the 1900s, they settled down to a sensible and standard design, such as those you can buy now at the hardware store. Before the Civil War, most axe handles, like the handles of all tools, were made by the man who would use the axe. A pattern was cut from a piece of flat wood and saved as the model from which future handles would be fashioned. Axe patterns, which you can still find in old barns, were so subtly curved and proportioned that they were as distinctive as a man's signature. You could take one look and say, this tool belongs to Jones, or that tool belongs to Smith. Very often an axe handle pattern was handed down from generation to generation, and it was considered counterfeit for another family to copy it. While we were on the subject of the handles of old tools, I would like to point out that the collector should also understand something of the philosophy about the connection between the workman's hand and the part of the hand that he touches. Most workmen will scoff at the idea, but any fine craftsman will tell you that the right wooden handle, let us say on a hammer, helps you along with your work. A metal or plastic handle or even an incorrect wooden handle can feel dead and not spring back against pressure, thus causing blisters and slowing your work. The proper handle's feel or heft is the unexplainable quality that a fine violin has to the musician. The Oxford History of Technology quotes Christian Barman's comments on an exhibition of early hand tools. Everybody who appreciates the qualities of materials loves wood, and here was wood formed into a special kind of tactile sculpture made to be felt with the hand. I remember that old craftsmen, when they buy a new set of modern chisels, throw away the handles and carefully fit their own. These handles, polished bright by a lifetime of use, became part of their owners' lives. Always in the fine art of working with wood, the old-time craftsman's laboratory was in his hand and his hands and his heart, in his head and his hands and his heart. He called it knack. Some now believe it was a sixth sense or an extrasensory power. Elusive as this knack may be, it is the most important part of those small differences that distinguish the modern craftsman from the good workman. When we consider tools, we are dealing with human benefactors of the most primary sort. Tools increase and vary human power. They economize human time, and they convert raw substances into valuable and useful products. So when we muse on historic tools as symbols, we are always analyzing the romance of human progress. Although early American tools were traditionally and designed to such an extent that one can usually tell the nationality of the maker, there are almost always, subtle differences and decorative touches in design that equally identify the region of American countryside from which the tool came. A collector can easily tell a piece coming from Pennsylvania from one coming from Connecticut. This distinctiveness was often intentional. The early American's urge for identification was born of pride, both in himself and in his time. An extraordinary awareness of life and time permeated our early days. When something was made with the maker was satisfied, it wasn't complete until his mark and the date were added. Nowadays, things are almost obsolete before they leave the drawing board. How lucky we are that so many of the old tools and things that were made with them were dated and touched with the craftsman's art. Here we have a pre-Civil War axe and the post-Civil War axe. And give you an idea of that curvature that's increased over time. And below that, we have an axe handle pattern was part of every man's toolkit. We have a fawn foot, scroll knob, and a swell knob shown there at the end of the axes, as opposed to a much plainer end of the pre-Civil War axe handle. So that brings us through the first chapter. The next part will be Crude Shop's magnificent results, and I'll give you a little preview of the pictures. They got some very nice illustrations. And I worked in such a shop when I was in Colonial Williamsburg. So, onward and upward, the carpenter's bench there. I hope you've enjoyed that. I enjoyed reading it. Took about 22 minutes, but I think that's pretty well spent. Hey, Jordan, good to see you. Nice to have everyone having joined. If you did enjoy this, give me a comment. Tell me what you think. We can do more of it. And yeah, that's what I'm thinking about today. Thanks for joining again.